1995. Man United player Eric Cantona assaults a fan in a match against Crystal Palace. The O.J. Simpson trial took place, lasting from January until October. And GoldenEye, the 17th James Bond film, was released. As one franchise was starting off with gold, this franchise was entering what is known as its golden era, specifically starting with this season of Thomas and Friends. First released on the 4th of January 1995 in the US and the 16th of October 1995 in the UK. This is the story of Thomas and Friends Season 4. While I mentioned in my Season 3 review that I personally was not the biggest fan of Thomas and Friends, there were a lot of people who disagreed at the time, because Season 3 was a runaway success. Not just in terms of critical acclaim and popularity, but it was bringing in a truckload of money. This was due to the success of Thomas and Friends in the United States and Japan, multitudes of VHS releases, and merchandise being at an all-time high, with some infamous Thomas toy lines such as the Ertl die-cast metal trains being a firm favourite among children of the time, myself included. With 11 years now passed since Season 1's airing in 1984, and their budget growing exponentially since then, it meant that this season could go bigger. Bigger in scale, bigger in production, bigger in quality, but the biggest upgrade was actually in the smallest of scale. We finally got the narrow gauge engines. Fan favourites in the books that weren't adapted during seasons 1 to 3. As stated, a lot had changed in 11 years. At the time, it just wasn't possible for smaller engines such as these to be in the series. Now they had a chance to do it, and boy did they take that chance. These models looked absolutely stunning, because they also gave the characters different liveries from the Railway series counterparts. In the Railway series, all the narrow gauge engines are one colour, they're all red, whereas the TV series decided to give each character their own individual colours. Peter, Sam and Sir Handel kept their original liveries when they were known as Stuart and Falcon in the Railway series books. Duncan was yellow, Rusty was orange, you get the idea. While I do love my Railway series lore, I do think this was a very smart decision for Brett Allcroft to make these characters different colours. That way children would be able to easily distinguish which character was which, and also added into the marketability when they sold them in the Ertl diecast models. Just because they could film the narrow gauge engines didn't necessarily mean that there wasn't any trouble when they did film them. As a matter of fact, the filming crew notoriously did not like working with these O-gauge engines. Their cylinders would jam, their eye mechanisms were faulty, and their body shells were too small to fit smoke units alongside their motors. For ease of filming and reliability, the 5th season would introduce larger scale versions, and they would be the ones used going forward. In Season 3, half of the stories were original stories, but this time they went back to the winning formula, and it was all Railway series stories. Only one original story, Rusty to the Rescue, was written by Britt Allcroft and David Mitton for this series. The episodes of the 4th season did take liberties when adapting the Railway series books, but that was more to fill runtime and make it more accessible to the audience. With this season introducing characters from the narrow gauge books, that meant that there were a ton of new characters to be introduced into the TV show. Duke, Peter Sam, Sir Handel, Scarlowe, Rheneas, Duncan, Rusty, Smudger, George the Steamroller, and that's just for the narrow gauge engines. For your standard gauge engines, we had Class 40, real life engine Stepney. We also had characters such as Scruffy, Caroline, and Bulstrode the Barge. So quite a lot of characters introduced this season. Again, down to the fact they had a bigger budget to introduce all of these characters and create new models. With the new models, they also built new sets for the narrow gauge engines. And boy, did they go big with these. There is so much intricate detail and so many things that they've been able to do with model making in that space of time that there's a reason why it's considered one of the best seasons from a visual perspective. You watch it and you are blown away by everything that they've been able to accomplish. It just looks so beautiful. And I won't lie, when I first watched season 4 as a kid, I didn't enjoy it. I was one of those ones that liked his routine and liked his consistency. It had taken me this long to get used to Michael Angelis in the UK for the voice narration. So then they bring in a whole fleet of characters, which the majority of the season is devoted to, that aren't the characters that I've been used to for 3 seasons. I was upset. I would more often than not skip those episodes to watch the ones that had the characters that I was familiar with. It's also why I thought it was very clever of Britt Allcroft and David Mitton. For some episodes when they were introducing the narrow gauge engines to start with, they would have the standard gauge engines essentially being the exposition dump for the audience. It was very clever, and it kept people like me, who weren't the biggest fan of change, interested in the show. But I think this is a season that you have to watch when you are older, when you've grown up and gotten a bit more mature. Another reason why I think Thomas and Friends is not just a kids show. Introducing an entirely new set of characters 4 seasons deep into your continuity is a bold move. There are lots of kids that don't like change, and that I know felt the same way as I did when I was a kid. Who were these engines? Why were they being introduced to us? Not a lot of kids knew about the Railway series books, at least not to the extent that we know of them now. And if you know Thomas and Friends through TV, you would be confused as to why, very randomly, these new engines just appear. But as you get older and you know more about the Thomas lore, you know that the narrow gauge engines were a major influence in the Railway series books, you know about their importance to the overall franchise of Thomas and Friends, you appreciate it so much more. And in turn, I love these narrow gauge engine stories now. I think they're absolutely fantastic. I appreciate everything that went into them. I appreciate the model work. I appreciate the engines themselves. Despite them being a gift for the people to use, they have a charm of their own, and you don't really appreciate how hard it would have been for them to work these little engines until you see shots with them next to the standard gauge engines, and you see the size difference. The fact they were able to do this in 1995 is a credit to the team. David Mitton once again puts in a directorial masterclass. It's something that all aspiring filmmakers should look at. Watch David Mitton's work from season 1 of Thomas and Friends to season 4, and you'll see a drastic improvement. I could gush on about this, but we have a ranking video to do, and I'm going to start my rankings of Thomas and Friends season 4. With one little caveat though. This was a very, very tough list to do. I do not think any of these episodes are bad. I think they are of superior quality, but there are some that I like more than others. Your list will be different than mine, and let me know in the comments how you would rank Thomas and Friends season 4. All I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. Okay, let's dive in. Number 26, Mind That Bike. Tom Tipper, a postal worker, is unhappy when his post van is replaced by a bicycle. Percy manages to help him out, but not in the way that he intended. A story adapted from Christopher Audrey's first book, and I've got to say, I'm not a big fan of the adaptation. The visuals are great, the fact that Percy's in a lead role is something that I really enjoy, but the story's quite boring. It doesn't really have much going for it. And considering that with a lot of these episodes, there is so much to enjoy about it, the fact that you don't have much to enjoy about this one, bit of a letdown. Number 25, Special Attraction. After Toby's missed opportunity to join a parade, Percy is called into the harbour to deal with Bulstrode, a highly disagreeable barge. Bulstrode makes the trucks more troublesome than usual, though he pays dearly for it. Who would have thought that this character, introduced from Christopher Audrey's tenure, would become one of the most popular characters of the franchise? It's even more amazing considering this is the only episode that Bulstrode actually appears in. Bulstrode was introduced in the book Toby, Trucks and Trouble, and his appearance does very closely mirror what is done in the book. But the special attraction part at the start of the episode, it really feels disjointed from the rest of it. You could tell that they wanted to adapt Bulstrode and just had to try and find a way to make up the runtime by adding this bit at the start with Toby being a special attraction and trying to find some sort of through line with it. Number 24, Henry and the Elephant. A circus comes to Sodor, but Henry and some workmen are called to investigate a blockage in the tunnel, where he unhappily comes across an elephant. There is one thing that I noticed about a lot of the standard gauge stories in this season. They're all continuations or stories that were missed out that tie in to stories from previous seasons. Henry and the Elephant is one that was taken from the 5th Railway series book, Troublesome Engines. In Tenders and Turntables, Gordon and James are both aggrieved and it leads to them going on strike. And at that point, you think Henry's just palling in because he's a bigger engine. In the books, this story is the reason why Henry decided to go on strike with the big engines in the first place, because he had an encounter with a runaway elephant. But one thing I did notice with this story is that they don't deliberately tie it in to Trouble in the Shed and Tenders and Turntables. They do that with other episodes in this season, but they don't do it with this one. And I think that actually was quite smart to do. Older fans like us, we know the backstory, but when you watch it at the time, you don't know any better. And it does stand on its own. And it actually helps develop the more softer side of Henry. So I got to admit, it was a good job with that. That being said, I wasn't the biggest fan of the tacked on intro at the start, and I would have liked to have seen this adapted into season 1 to see how it would have worked. But we've got what we've got, and I don't mind it. Number 23, Rusty to the rescue. When Rusty hears that an engine is needed to help run the Bluebell Railway, he ventures out to find one and meets a steam engine named Stepney. Last season, we had an introduction of a real railway engine in the city of Truro and the 2 tenders of the Flying Scotsman. And this season, we get introduced to Stepney, the Bluebell engine, another real-life engine. His railway series origins is completely different than the TV series origins. I can kind of understand now why they changed it, because of how dark his introduction in the Railway series books is. In the Railway series books, Percy and Douglas are talking about how engines are being essentially executed on the other railway, because this is the time of dieselisation and steam engines were being scrapped left, right and centre. But one engine who had managed to escape this fate was Stepney, and he was coming over to Sodor to visit them. So it was a bit too dark to probably introduce to your standard childlike audience. I mean, I still had nightmares about Pop Goes the Diesel in season 2. Imagine if they tried to introduce this type of dark story in season 4. So Britt Allcroft and David Mitton got a little bit creative. Rusty was sent out to find the Bluebell engine to run a particular part of the line. He goes to the other railway, where Douglas had found Oliver in the previous season. He manages to find Stepney, and they essentially do another great escape and stow him away. It is a downgrade, I'm not going to lie. I enjoy it, especially as I've gotten older, but it's still a downgrade, especially when it is just a copy and paste of Escape. It's kind of like that Mr. Bean meme that you see where someone's writing and then Mr. Bean is looking over the answers to try and copy it. It's essentially Rusty to the rescue to Escape. But they wanted to introduce Stepney, they had to figure out a way to do it, and overall, they did not bad. Number 22, Bullseyes. Daisy claims to Toby that she would simply have to toot to scare animals off. However, when she comes across a bull, she realises that it'll need more than a command to move it away. Another story where the main arc was introduced in a previous season. When Daisy was introduced in season 2, they mentioned at the start of Percy's predicament that she was frightened of cows and bulls. At the end of that episode, they mentioned how she was able to shoe a cow all by herself the other day. This is the story in between that, when Daisy is so full of herself thinking that if she just tooted at a cow or a bull, it would just move aside for her. And this comes back and bites her on her front. This is one that I do think should have been in season 2 as part of the 3-story arc. They did a 3-story arc during that season with Duck and Diesel. Why couldn't they have just done it with Daisy? It would have made sense. Another 3-story arc around the Diesel. I also noticed in this that Daisy's makeup is a bit more toned down in this season. She still has the eyeshadow and the rosy cheeks, but I don't think it's as prominent as it was in season 2. Probably down to the sexism issues that I had mentioned. But that being said, one of the things I do like about this episode is because of the aesthetic changes, it really benefits it. Season 2 was more industrial, more workmanlike, and more gritty, so you didn't have that kind of storybook slice of life vibe that you got from this episode. It's one of those ones that's kind of in the middle for me. I noticed the flaws, but I still enjoy it. I like the ending with the schoolboys with the bull's eyes. That makes me chuckle. And the image of championing the bull just right at the front of Daisy and her just looking so, affronted, it makes me giggle. Number 21, train stops play. Stepney does not realise that a cricket ball has landed in one of his trucks. Caroline the car sets off with the players in pursuit of Stepney along the branch line. I'm not a big fan of Caroline the car. She is so whiny, temperamental, fussy. It's another piece of evidence as to why people would say Thomas and Friends is a sexist show. It's a female car who complains about doing everything and then eventually is completely worn out chasing after Stepney. Don't get me wrong, it's because this car is an older car, but I do think it could be considered sexist by today's standards. The execution of the story is great though. The one thing that always confused me was the running order of these episodes. On the running order on my VHS when I had it and the DVD that I have now, Train Stops Play is after Bowled Out. Bowled Out is when Stepney leaves to go back to his Bluebell Railway. In the next episode, he's back and it's bang smack in the middle of his time there on Sodor. It's a continuity thing. It's things that I just don't like. That throws my brain off. I'm used to order. I'm used to the way things are presented. I just don't get why they switched them round. But I enjoyed the episode. Number 20, Thomas and the Special Letter. The Fat Controller reads a letter inviting the engines to visit the mainland. Thomas becomes very conceited and puts his big trip in jeopardy after crashing through a set of buffers and into a brick wall. The 100th episode of the show. And you could tell that they wanted this to be a big celebration and wanted every engine that they could get from the standard gauge onto this show. It's why, even though I find the start very tacked on, because it is, it's just there so we can see all the engines going past. It's still good because we see all the engines. These are the type of things that I wish that Calling All Engines did, because that's meant to be calling all engines. So where were all the engines? Season 4 showed them an example of that. A very tacked on example, but a great way of how we can get all of the engines that were introduced into an episode, especially when it's a landmark 100th episode. I do prefer the original story from the 8 Famous Engines book, and Thomas's crash is just an extravagant crash for an extravagant crash's sake, because it's the 100th episode. Still enjoy it, and it's a great 100th episode for the series. Number 19, Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady. One day, Henry threatens to leave without Peter Sam's passengers. In a haste to meet his connection, Peter Sam accidentally leaves the Refreshment Lady behind. I've mentioned goofs in previous videos of mine. The most recurring goof is when an engine has a different resin face that you don't associate with the character now. Thomas using Percy's face in Season 1, Percy using Thomas's face in Season 3, Edward using James's face in Season 1. You get the idea. I never really noticed these as a kid, but this was one that I noticed. Henry wearing Gordon's resin face. This was the stuff of nightmares for me as a kid. This is so famous now, this character now has its own name, Gordon, because it's Henry's body with Gordon's face. Some of the fans also call him Gendry, Gordon, Henry, but for me, I prefer Gordon. I think it just rolls off the tongue better. And it's a shame because this goof is really the only thing that people remember when they talk about this episode. Is that down to the story being a bit bland? Possibly. But I do enjoy this episode. I enjoy all the narrow gauge episodes. But for me, this is the weakest one. It's kind of like Thomas and the Guard, but in narrow gauge form. Number 18, Gallant Old Engine. Duncan hears the story of how Rhaenys saved the railway from closure, even after suffering a serious breakdown. And Rhaenys returns to the railway. Love the story, love Rhaenys, love all the visuals, love the big scene at the end with all the engines welcoming Rhaenys back. I do have one problem though. How does this story turn Duncan's attitude around? It doesn't make sense to me why it would all of a sudden turn it around for him. He's never met Rhaenys, he has no connection with him, he maybe knows of him through Scarlowe, but until you actually meet someone, you never really know what they're like. You just hear stories, and you make your assumptions on them after you meet them in the flesh. Scarlowe's trying to tell this story to Duncan about how passengers are important, but the passengers are not involved in the resolution of this story. I know in a broader sense, you could say because Rhaenys was able to get that train back, more people kept coming to the island, kept coming to the railway, thus he did save the railway, and the passengers supported that. But for me, it's just always bothered me. No reason that the story was told for me is just to say, oh yeah, this is a story about Rhaenys. Oh, and he's coming home. Yay, big celebration. It does its job in that sense. I just don't think it needs that to tie into Duncan's story. That is a Railway series flaw for me. Nothing to do with the adaptation. Number 17, Four Little Engines. Sir Handel was pushed off the rails by some angry coaches. A red narrow gauge engine named Scarloy is the only engine available and is determined to get his passengers home, even when one of his front springs breaks. This episode combines two railway stories, Scarloy Remembers and Old Faithful. I've always said that this can be hit or a miss. This one's a hit. There are some great opening shots here. Some of the model making work that I mentioned is definitely on display. It sets the scenes for you. It beds you into that nice, warm, comfy environment that season 4 is known for. And the story itself is really heartwarming and inspiring. You really gravitate to Scarloy as a character through this episode, and it's really enjoyable. Number 16, Thomas and Stepney. Stepney has been invited to visit the Fat Controller's Railway. Thomas is jealous when the visiting engine is talked about more than he is, and is shunted for Stepney to pass when a special train comes that night. Once again, the intro is very clunky. What I don't really understand about it is this. I know it seems like I'm on season 4. I'm really not. I do enjoy it, but these are always little niggles for me. In Rusty to the Rescue, Thomas is shown going past the Bluebell Railway, talking to Rusty, which leads into the opening of that episode for Rusty to go and find Stepney. This next episode, Thomas just seems to have forgotten about this railway. He doesn't go past it anymore. They're meant to establish that Stepney's line is so far away that it's a big deal that he's going to come and visit them. But Thomas has already been there, so it doesn't seem that far away. It just breaks that idea that Stepney is this stranger from a faraway land that's coming to see them, because Thomas has already been there. But the episode itself, I really enjoyed. Once again, they had to find a way to get Stepney to the island of Sodor because they changed his origin story from the Railway series book. So there will be flaws when you're trying to do something like that. I enjoy the nighttime sequence where Thomas gets shunted, but when there's flaws that niggle at me, I have to point them out. And that's where you guys come in the comments. Let me know down below if there's a logical explanation. Number 15, a bad day for Sir Handel. Sir Handel and Peter Sam are brought to help Scarloy and his best friend Renee's. Sir Handel is in a bad mood and deliberately derails himself on purpose to get out of work. Now that I've watched all of the hit era of Thomas and Friends and seen how they changed Sir Handel into the kind of wise old sage, and knowing what he's like when you first introduce him in season 4, it just makes me so gutted. You only see Sir Handel in season 4 and you don't see him at any other points in between until he's reintroduced in season 10. Because I would love to see how he got from being this little prick to this wise old sage. That's an arc that I have explored in my own fanfiction because it was something that really bothered me. But I like this episode because you see how much of an arse Sir Handel is and how he's willing to do something completely stupid to get himself out of doing jobs he doesn't want to do. I also like his dynamic with Peter Sam. It's kind of a good cop, bad cop thing. Peter Sam's the nice one. Sir Handel's the one that just doesn't give. It's a good episode. I like the opening. Well done. Number 14, Rock and Roll. Rusty is concerned about Duncan, who ignores his warning about a broken section of track. After Duncan derails, Rusty begrudgingly comes to the rescue. Another example of the airing order and the release order of episodes on VHS and DVDs that break continuity for me. In this episode, Duncan's already introduced, his rocking and rolling is already established, and this is the resolution of Duncan and Rusty's arc. So why is it not after Home at Last? They've quite literally put the cart before the horse here. Again, I am not saying anything bad about the episode itself. I really like this episode. I like Duncan. I like Rusty. The story itself, I do enjoy. But the airing order is what really bothers me about it. Now, there is a video from the YouTuber The Yellow Striker that I recommend that you check out because he does a comparison between this episode of Rock and Roll and an episode from the hit era, which I will not mention, but he says that it's superior to this episode. I was skeptical watching it at first, but then I watched it and listened to his arguments, and he's got some excellent points in there. So if you haven't already, go and watch the video, come back, let me know what your thoughts are about it, and also make sure you give Yellow Striker a sub. The episode is a bit slice of life, but for me, I find it very enjoyable, and the Duncan-James dynamic is very strong. I can see why they revisited it in the hit era. Number 13, Home at Last. Peter Sam informs Scarloy of the newest arrival, a careless and bad-tempered engine named Duncan. Soon, Scarlowe is sent to Duncan's aid when he is stuck under a decrepit tunnel. Do you see what I mean now? Go back and listen to Rock and Roll's description, and then listen to Home at Last's description. Home at Last is the introduction of Duncan, so Rock and Roll shouldn't be before that introduction. I don't blame the people that made the episodes. I blame the people that put them out for airing in this order. But it doesn't take away from the fact that this episode, solid. A great introduction to the character of Duncan, lots of great scenery, lots of great directing by David Mitton, and I thoroughly enjoy it. Number 12, Bulldog. Falcon was sent to take the mountain road with Duke. However, he was impatient and did not pay attention to Duke's advice. He eventually winded up dangling from a cliff. For me, this episode was a big example of how far they had come in terms of set design. You look at that mountain road and it is beautiful. Some of the shots in here, I have stated before, are model making porn. If that is your thing, you will be so excited by it. And one of the things that I loved about this episode as well was the music. I always loved Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell's scores, but what I've loved in this season in particular is the new music that is on display for the narrow gauge engines. The Scarlowe Railway theme, Rusty's theme, they're all fantastic. They're all done so well, and it just adds into the greatness of this episode. And of course we see why Duke is so revered and beloved by the engines. Any other engine probably would have let Falcon fall to his death for being a little git. But Duke stood firm, held on to him, didn't let go, and saved Falcon's life. And I just love how nonchalantly Duke says at the end, you just had a new coat of paint, would have been a shame if you rolled down the mountain and spoiled it. What a way to take the mood out of the room, man. The only thing I didn't like about it, once again, is the tacked on intro, but when I was a kid, I did enjoy the intro, so I know why it's there. Number 11, You Can't Win. One evening, Duke is too ill to manage by himself. Stuart teases him about this, but Duke gets his own back, and he proves that he's still a lot of life left in him. Bulldog and You Can't Win were flip-flopping on my list constantly. At some points, I would think Bulldog had the edge. At other points, I would think You Can't Win had the edge. What really turned it around for me was that from this episode, Stuart seems to have learned a lesson, and by the time he comes to the Fat Controller's Railway, his attitude has completely changed. When he has become Peter Sam, he is more humble, he is more gracious, he's a lot nicer. And I think that this episode was the catalyst for that, because he's very much like Falcon / Sir Handel at this point. He's cocky, he's prickish. He outright calls Duke old and tells him, yeah, we're going to replace you because you're past it, mate. And at a point, it does look like that's going to be the case, because Duke takes not well. Stuart and Falcon have to go and save him. But then it turns out Duke isn't as ill as they thought he was, and he gives Stuart a right showing up. And I think that is what humbles Stuart. So when we see him as Peter Sam, when he comes to the Fat Controller's Railway, there's a reason why his attitude has changed, because Duke put him right in his place. It's an awesome episode. There's no tacked on intro by this point, because we are now established that this is the new engines that we are going to be getting used to in this season, and it's a Duke-centric episode. What's not to love about them? Number 10, Fish. Extra vans are added to the Flying Kipper, and as a result, Henry needs a back engine to help him up Gordon's Hill. Duck offers to help, but a badly attached tail lamp causes a problem. This is a story that I really enjoy, and I think was very well adapted from Christopher Audrey's book. But I think the episode does improve upon it from its use of camera work. A lot of the low angle shots, all the shots from seeing the back of the engines rather than the front facing. The nighttime visuals are fantastic. An episode around Duck and Henry on their own, which wasn't as prominent. The music is amazing. And the end when Duck crashes into the fish fans, just great. Number 9, Passengers and Polish. Duncan complains about not getting polished. His rudeness reaches its peak when he stops in a viaduct and refuses to move. Oh, I love this episode. I think this is an episode for adults to really enjoy, not kids, because a lot of adults will relate to this in a working environment. We've all been in jobs where we have felt underappreciated, undervalued, overworked, and underpaid. We've all had those moments where we just want to go, screw this, I ain't doing nothing, and you ain't making me. But most of the time, we don't act on it. But you watch this episode, and you can understand why Duncan is understandably aggrieved, and you see him stop doing his work on a viaduct, probably with high winds, where passengers could easily just fall to their death. And he's like, screw you, I ain't moving. And he doesn't. It's brilliant. It really appeals to that rebel in me, the one that just wants to stick the middle fingers up at society and tell them to go and screw themselves. Duncan is just at his anarchistic best in this episode. It's tense, it's dramatic, the ending is very well executed. I just loved it. Number 8, special funnel. Peter Sam's funnel is knocked off by an icicle and is temporarily replaced by a drain pipe. However, Peter Sam gives the other engines a run for their money once his new funnel arrives. I mentioned in the Season 3 ranking video that the winter episodes then were where they peaked. They found their level for winter settings, and that was as high as they could go. What I want to clarify is that I do not mean that the standards dropped after that. I mean they constantly wanted to be as good as that, if not better. And Special Funnel is a prime example of that. It's a totally different setting, a totally different environment, but the winter effects are so damn good in this. I love the story itself, because poor Peter Sam has been through the ringer at this point. He's had his old funnel knocked off after it being severely damaged. They can't find any other way to regulate the smoke, which causes the passengers to get really ticked off, so they just have to fit a drain pipe to the top of him to use it. And of course, the other engines rip the absolute piss out of him for it. So it makes it all the sweeter when he gets that new Giesel funnel. At least I think it's called Giesel. I always rotate between Giesel and Geisel. He becomes feckin' Hulk Hogan. This Giesel funnel roided him out his nut. You can do so much more. And it puts the rest of them royally in their place. Number 7, Steamroller. Skarloey tears Sir Handel of an anti-railway steamroller named George, whom Sir Handel vows to pay out, only to find that both he and George are too evenly hot-headed. Oh, I love George, because he's such a prick. Similar to what Baldu is in Season 3, George for Season 4. He is a road rebel. He is an anarchist. He would be very happy to destroy every bit of rail on the island so the roads would win. And what I really love about it is that because he's paired up with Sir Handel, who is just as much of a prick, the chemistry flies off the screen. You don't know who to root for, because they're both dickheads. Number 6, Trucks, or Rusty helps Peter Sam. Gordon advises Sir Handel to get out of work by pretending to be ill, leaving Peter Sam and a little narrow-gauge diesel named Rusty to take over. However, some trucks mistake Peter Sam for Sir Handel and crash into him at the incline. I want my fans to go and try and find something, if you can. Try and find the crash sequence where the trucks crash into Peter Sam, but try and find it with Jim Ross, the WWE commentator, dubbed over Michelangelo's instead. Absolutely hilarious. And it really does sum up how you feel when this crash goes down. I think this is one of the best crashes of Thomas and Friends. It looks so brutal, and it does have severe consequences. With a lot of crashes, you see some damage, but not to the extent that I think Peter Sam had in this one. You hear about how much of a beating that he's taken, and when you see him just slowly trundling away afterwards, you feel so sorry for the guy, because it's not his fault. It's also a great episode to introduce us to Rusty, the little diesel, and again it shows us that not all diesels are bad. I do think that Gordon and Sir Handel had a very good combination. Sir Handel sees Gordon as who he wants to be, the one that gets all the special trains, the one that is important, the one that everybody else should look up to and admire. So of course when Gordon tells him, look, easy way to get out your work, say you're no well, of course Sir Handel's going to jump on that. Number 5, Paint Pots and Queens, or Thomas meets the Queen. After the accidents about ditches and mines, the Queen comes to Sodor, giving Gordon and Thomas a special opportunity. An episode I never would have thought would have dated, and the reason is because sadly, Queen Elizabeth passed away on the 8th of September 2022. The Queen felt like one of those figures that would outlive all of us, so a lot of media will feel outdated if they have included her in it. But it is a Railway series accurate story. The Queen did come to Sodor, so the adaptation has to stick. But it doesn't stick the landing entirely for me. And again, it's because of continuity. They do establish that this episode takes place after Down the Mine from season 1. What they really needed to do was try and keep it as season 1 accurate as possible. So they should have just had engines 1 through 7 in this episode. Duck is in this episode. He was not on Sodor at the time. One of the Scottish twin engines was in this episode. He was not on Sodor at this time. And I understand they're likely to make mistakes, need other engines to fill in background, but there are 7 other engines that you could have used. If you're going to tie it in to a season 1 story, you have to keep it as close to season 1 as you can. You're not telling me that someone couldn't have popped in a VHS tape and went, by the way, Duck ain't in this. By the way, Donald and Douglas ain't in this. Don't use them. Of course they could have done it. And that's what makes it so hard for me to comprehend, because David Mitton was a stickler for detail. I think it's why so many fans jump on the goofs and jump on these little things, because we know how great David Mitton was. We know how great that team was that worked on Thomas and Friends in the classic era. They were fantastic. They tried to get everything right down to the most minute detail. So when we do see things like this, of course we're a bit thrown by it, because we're the audience that they're trying to convince that this world is real and the timelines are accurate. But that being said, it does not take away the fact that this episode is absolutely brilliant. The music, on point. The direction, fantastic. The engine models have never looked better. I personally think that this episode of season 4, because they knew it was going to involve the Queen, that there had to be a step up in quality. And they did that. Number 4, bowled out. A stuck-up Diesel insults the engines and makes a fool of himself when he sucks an inspector's bowler hat through his air intake vent. Duck and Stepney volunteer in taking his train. The actual conclusion of the Stepney story arc, and what a conclusion it is. I love it in the Railway Series books, and I love it here. The Class 40 Diesel is such a prick, but he's just what you need. Bring in Diesel that looks down on engines, tells them that they're useless, tells them that they should all be scrapped. Diesel gets shown up, Diesel goes away in disgrace. It's a winning formula, and all the shots of Duck and Stepney pulling this train are just amazing. What can I say? This episode is beautiful. Number 3, Sleeping Beauty. After many years have passed, some rescuers begin a journey to find Duke and reunite him with his old friends. This is an episode that just makes you feel all warm and happy and cozy inside, because the ending of Grandpuff is very dark. But going from that despair to going to this episode and them having this big conclusion to go and find Duke, and he's reunited with now Peter, Sam and Sir Handel, it's just beautiful. Audrey was fantastic at these types of stories, and there's a reason why Audrey wanted to end the Railway Series books with these stories. They were his endgame. All roads led to that in the Narrow Gauge saga. The only downside is that it's not as accurate, because in the Railway Series books, they use the small engines, Mike, Ari and Bert, to go and find Duke. They can't do that in this season because they've just got the narrow gauge engines. Imagine trying to get engines smaller than them to work. It would be a colossal nightmare, but it does not take away from the fact that this episode is amazing. Number 2, Toad stands by. Toad advises Oliver on how to regain the truck's respect. Oliver struggles to pull a goods train, but he is so determined that he accidentally pulls Scruffy apart. Do I think this episode would have worked if they'd just done it in season 3? Yes, I do, but I also am quite glad that it was delayed to season 4. The story itself is fantastic, because you go from thinking in season 3 that Oliver's a bit of a cocky prick to this episode where you really want to root for him, to see him get back to the type of engine that we know he can be. The sequence with Oliver and that train going to rip apart Scruffy is very well done. This story equals greatness. End of. But not as great as the number 1 episode of Thomas and Friends, season 4, is Grandpuff. Thomas tells the story of Duke, a narrow gauge engine who worked with Stuart, also known as Peter Sam, and Falcon, also known as Sir Handel. However, when the railway closed, the young engines were sold, and the old engine was left abandoned in a shed. And that was how the episode ended. Duke was abandoned in a shed, and over the years that passed, he was buried alive. I have covered this in my Engines That Were Buried Alive episode. It is such a dark, downer, depressing ending that you did not think that they would do, but they did it. And they did it so well. This story is depressing as f. You're watching a railway collapse in front of your eyes. First you see them and they're all happy and they're all working together. And then Duke tells them a story about Smudger, who didn't listen to people's advice and then was turned into a generator, never moving again. Presumably left to his death, because later on, the mines in the hill close, the railway closes, Stuart and Falcon are bought and taken away, but Duke isn't. They put him in a shed and leave him. So 2 engines, one that has been turned into a generator, and one that is our main protagonist of this story, are just left to die. As Percy said, that's not a happy ending. You get the resolution in Sleeping Beauty, but you never find out what happened to Smudger. I guess he was just left there to die as well. But this episode is emotional, beautiful, it's captivating, it's engaging, heartwarming, and heartbreaking at the same time, and a fantastic introduction to the narrow gauge engines that became a firm fan favourite amongst a lot of Thomas fans. And although I didn't like them when I was younger, they are my favourite now. And that is my ranking of Thomas and Friends Season 4. Let me know in the comments what you think about Season 4. And until next time, keep on chugging.